here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when I was born, apparently, there was some sort of a heart murmur, so they kept me in the hospital, and they didn't know if I would have my Brit Milah on time, but it was. And after the ceremony, when people left, sometime later in the day, my mother told me this story. She asked to go to the nursery to see me, and they found me in a pool of blood, hemorrhaging, near death. In those days, pediatric medicine was not great, but I survived. It was Hashem's blessing that I survived. So I look at that, and I know that there's a reason that I was kept alive. The next
To make Donna
memory.
happy.
Hmm?
To make Donna happy.
I hope so. I hope I've succeeded. I was 4 years old. My parents took me to Reese Park in the Rockaways to the beach, and the undertow swept me out, and I had a near drowning experience, and that's when I had my first relationship with Hashem underwater. I didn't have a name for what I was communicating with. At 4 years old, I wasn't too verbal to begin with. Still aren't. But as I was floating and twisting and turning underwater, this voice basically told me, hold your mouth open, hold the air that you have in your mouth, and just wait. And sure enough, I bumped into somebody's legs, and I was pulled up by my hair.
Oh, wow.
And saved again. But there was some entity that was responsible for that I related to. Years later, I'll call that Hashem. My family background was somewhat similar. My father was a member of a conservative synagogue. Well, I'll give you another memory first, I'm sorry. I had notes, but my wife said, leave your notes at home, it's your life. So I have to remember chronologically how things line up. I was 4 years old, and apparently my parents took me to their local synagogue. They lived in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and the synagogue was called the Kane Street Shul. It's a very famous shul. Aaron Copland, the famous composer, was bar mitzvahed there, like in the early 1900s. Goldman Sachs had his wedding there, and it's still a historic landmark today. But it was Simchas Torah. I know that from the experience. Years later, I knew that. Because somehow, at some point, I was marching down the aisles with a flag and an apple, while the gold-toothed women in the aisle were singing Ein Keloheinu, with the famous Ein Keloheinu, na, 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 na. And for some reason, I just really enjoyed that music. And felt great having a flag, I don't know, whatever it was. But that was my earliest Jewish memory. Anyways, I grew up in Brooklyn. We moved when I was 4 years old to Kensington, which is all was then all lower middle class, struggling people, mostly Jews and a few Italians and an occasional Irishman. And my father was a member of a conservative synagogue, the Flatbush Jewish Center. He went to high holiday services, that's about as much of it, you know, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. We stood outside as kids. And they sent me to Hebrew school when I was like 7 years old. Unfortunately, I got there like after the semester began, and everybody had already started with the Aleph Bets, and I had to like catch up, so I never became a good reader, which has always been a weakness. In any case, But when I hit about 10, they took me out of class and they brought me down to the sanctuary because apparently somehow somebody selected me with some other kids to try out to learn to read from a Sefer Torah. Guess it was my great voice. In any case, I could barely see over the cloth. I was a very short kid. I was vertically challenged. So I could barely see the script. And my mastery of the Aleph Beis wasn't great, so by the time I got through 3 words, they pulled me off of there and they sent me back to my classroom. I was very disappointed, but internally, I basically promised myself that someday I would find out what was in that scroll. My brother got bar mitzvahed. He's 3 years older than me. And my father bought him a tallis and a pair of tefillin. And when it was my turn, I inherited my brother's tefillin. My father bought me a new tallis down on the Lower East Side somewhere, one of those little short ones with the fringes. And we had moved to Canarsie the year of my bar mitzvah, and the only synagogue around that was close was an Orthodox shul, Flatlands Jewish Center. So they sent me for bar mitzvah lessons. And I remember myself and a couple of the other kids in the bar mitzvah class, the teacher was a Rebbe, obviously European, and we didn't know what we were doing. We put a sign on his door, "I'm a Yid," and we all laughed, thought it was very funny. And he came out, after he saw the sign, he says, "I'm glad I'm a Yid, someday you'll understand." In any case, in my home, we had a Chanukiah, we only had one, so we took turns lighting on alternate nights. We ate matzah on Pesach and no bread and no cake, but we didn't change our dishes or turn over the kitchen or anything else. Pretty much on Sukkah, we went to the synagogue, Sukkah, that was it. Saw apples hanging from the branches and stuff, very interesting. But my Hebrew school was a very Zionistic Hebrew school for whatever reason. It was early in 1955 and beyond. So Israel was very young, and they kept showing us films about the pioneers and the swamps and all stuff. So I started developing this feeling inside for the land of Israel. In any case, when I was living in Canarsie as a young teenager, my parents didn't have very many books. They were not readers. Other than the newspaper or Reader's Digest, there were very few books in the house. But there was one book on the shelf, A Pictorial History of the Second World War. And I used to look at that book, and inside were the photographs taken on the command of General Eisenhower of the concentration camps. Seeing bodies piled up and people in striped uniforms like skeletons. And I asked my father, "What's this about?" Because I didn't know anything about the Holocaust at that time. And I said, "Why did this happen?" And he said, "Because we're Jews." And he said, "We," as though he was there too. But we didn't have relatives who died in the Holocaust. We were lucky. Most of our relatives that we knew of came over in the early 1900s. So, but we identified. And what bothered me at that time was there was no logic to that entire event. So I asked myself, why do these people hate us so much? And later in my life, I tried to find the answer to that. So anyway, fast forward. I'm about 14, 15 years old. I have a bunch of guys that are friends. We have a close friendship, and we're all beginning to be spiritually searching together. So we're hanging out in some guy's basement, and we're talking about the meaning of the universe and what infinity is and when it all starts and when it all ends, and discussing these ideas that philosophers can spend years dealing with. But at 14, we think we know everything. So, in any case, that started me out searching. When I got to the end of high school, I began to worry about getting to college and avoiding the draft, because we were in the middle of Vietnam. So, fortunately, I went to college and got a deferment for a while. And pretty much I lived a secular life, and one of the things I didn't mention earlier was that, a little background, I'm out of chronology because I don't have my notes, is my mother grew up in a home, and she was born in 1920, and she grew up in a home which was Shomer Shabbos until the early Depression. Her mother actually owned a kosher restaurant on the Lower East Side. But all of that ended with the Depression. And my maternal grandfather was a tailor, so he kept his shop open on Shabbos and so on. My paternal grandparents were glazers. They owned a glass store in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And my paternal grandmother's father, my great-grandfather, was the last Torah Jew in the family. His name was Meir Paretsky. I'll have meaning in a little while when I get to another point. But that grandmother, my paternal grandmother, lit Shabbos candles as long as I can remember. Although she lived a much secular life other than that, I think. So that was the parental background. And my parents spoke Yiddish, but not to us. They didn't teach us Yiddish. They spoke to themselves to keep things private. They spoke to neighbors, and they spoke to their parents in Yiddish. Nevertheless, when I got to college, not to move forward, those are the only things I was worried about, was getting drafted. I finally lost my deferment, but they had the lottery, so I got 302, and that year they went to 272, so I made it through that period. And when I got out of college, I went to work, my first real job after being an editor for scientific journals. I was trained on the job at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn in cardiology, and I became a technical supervisor in a cardiac care unit, a CCU. We had a 10-bed unit, and our mortality rate, as it is today, it hasn't really improved in all those 50 years. It's about 30%. That is, 30% of the patients who go into a CCU don't make it. I resuscitated, or attempted to resuscitate, many patients because I was involved on the code team. Those who survived, I got to speak to about 30% of them, and found that many of them had similar perceptions in their near-death experiences. So I became very interested in what you might call thanatology, the study of death. Here I am, 22 years old, studying death, because it's all around me. So I'm reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead and other sources. And I'll back up and tell you also that in college we were forced to take courses in Eastern religions. So I read the Gita, the Upanishads, Lao Tzu, Confucius, you name it. They had us going through all this esoteric spiritual stuff from different cultures. No Torah. In any case, but all that played on my mind, dealing with death and dying every day. I worked there for 5 years. And that coupled with some psychotropic agents, since I was an old hippie by that time, 23, 24, caused me to see reality in a slightly different way. I didn't know if the claims of the survivors was an actual perception of what happens when you die, or simply the physiology of dying itself. That question still remains, and by training, I am a physiologist. So, nevertheless, I had a very close friend who I still keep in contact with, I grew up with as a teenager. In fact, I just spoke to him this week. And he was a searcher spiritually, also Jewish, but totally secular. He went in a different direction. However, I began to read some of the same things he was reading. Works by P.D. Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and other Eastern individuals who dealt with very esoteric appreciations of reality. But then I began to read two sources that basically catapulted me back into Yiddishkeit. I began to read Carl Jung, a book which I believe is titled Western Man in Search of Soul, where he talks about the collective unconscious, or collective consciousness, if you were. And it made sense to me that we Jews born of Jewish mothers have an understanding internally, maybe it's in your DNA or however you want to put it, that we are connected organically, and that the Torah itself is organic, and that what we call reality, life, is really Hashem. You daven to Hashem, some people think that Hashem is like an entity, a force, an energy. Hashem is life. So I also read Martin Buber, I and Thou. Very famous work. Talks about relationships. A relationship among people is a spiritual event, according to Buber. And made sense that when we're all connected, we are introducing one another's neshamas to each other. You know, we say Tselem Elokim. You know, in India they say Namaste. I see the God within you. And when you're hung up on your own individual problems and things, you don't think about that. You have to take yourself out of life in order to analyze it and realize that there's something else going on, and you have to tap into that. So, relationship with other people is a way of relating to Hashem. So that started me on a search. When I finished, so I'm going for my master's degree at LIU, Long Island University on Flatbush Avenue, and I'm going from the parking lot, and there's a Chabad mitzvah mobile sitting on the corner, and this bearded guy calls me in and says, "Are you Jewish?" I go, "Yeah." And he says, "Come on inside, put on tefillin." So I did. So he says, "Do you have a siddur and a chumash at home?" I said, "No." So he said, "You should get some and keep it in your home." So I'm working in Maimonides, which is a very Jewish area. We had, it's sort of strange now, but a lot of my patients were very frum Jews from various sects. Black Hats, Haredim, Hasidim, they're all over there in Borough Park. And I used to see their families and their other members of the community davening out in the hallway. I'm in a coronary care unit where they're dying, and I'm thinking these people are like foreigners to me. You know, I didn't understand who they were. I didn't understand who I was until years later. But I went to one of the bookstores local in Borough Park, and I picked myself up a siddur and a chumash, and I put it on my shelf and stood there for many years. Until I got out of graduate school, I finished my doctoral dissertation. And I sat in my study, totally deflated, thinking that how many years of schooling, 6 years, 7 years of public school, junior high school, college, graduate school, another graduate school. I spent all that time in education in the secular world, and it was totally meaningless to me. And at that time, coincidentally, there's a lot of coincidences, the TV show by Landsman, The Shoah, was showing on TV. It's like 29 plus hours of documentary. And I sat glued to that show every week, watching another element of that show, and asked the same question I did when I was 14 years old. Why? Why does the world hate us so much? And I said, I don't know what it is to be a Jew. I know I am one. I have to find out. So I took that chumash off the shelf, and every night, around midnight, I'd get out of bed, if I was already in bed, go down to my dining room. I was already married at that time, my first wife. Light some candles, turn all the other lights out, and read the chumash. So after a period of time, I read the chumash cover to cover. And my ex-wife used to get bitterly angry that I would be staying up at night and going to work in the morning and doing that. But I had a drive to do this. And subsequent after that, I read through the Nevi'im and the Ketubos. So I figured I had knocked out a lot of the basics. At least I had a preliminary understanding of what was in there. Then I took a trip back to my old college, and I went to the college library one day, and I found on the shelf a book, because my father had mentioned to me years before that he always wanted to learn Kabbalah. My father didn't know much, but for whatever reason, he planted the seed in my mind. So up on the bookshelf was this huge volume, about 440 pages, written by Gershom Scholem, a book about Kabbalah, in which he has a tremendous essay on having a senior moment, but that's okay. Anyway, it's quite a book. I spent the entire day reading through that book, and the cosmology just made perfect sense to me. Although I didn't know all of the symbolism, there was something there that just said, this is where you're going to find things. So then, going through various bookstores, I picked up these paperback books written by a so-called Rabbi Berg, who has very bad, very bad public relations nowadays. But he used to run something called the Kabbalah Center.
Yes, all the books. There were other people, but they were all Berg.
All Berg, right? So I contacted this organization, and they keep inviting me to retreats and things. And as I'm talking to them, I think this is a cult. I'm not getting involved with these people. I want to go to where the source is. I want to find some Orthodox Jews and find a teacher. So I went to Chabad in Philadelphia and sat through a couple of lectures. That didn't work. Then a friend of mine said, at Sons of Israel in Cherry Hill, they have a class on Thursday night. It was a Beit Midrash program here, headed by Rabbi Yosef Yaffe. and Chaim Safran. Right? And so I decided to go. Well, this was very coincidental with the fact that my ex-wife got tired of me trying to grow in Judaism because I decided I wanted to be kosher. I stopped eating non-kosher meat. I ate fish and dairy and other things. And one day I decided I was not lighting the barbecue on Shabbos because I didn't want to kindle a flame. Well, she exploded. And in any case, push came to shove, eventually she decided she didn't want to be married anymore. But this happened coincidentally with me finding the Thursday night shiur. So I decided I have to find a lawyer because the divorce is imminent. So I opened the yellow pages, remember those things?
Yes.
And I looked for a Jewish lawyer, a Jewish name in the lawyers, you know. So I found this guy in Marlton and I call him up. He says, come to my office tomorrow. So I go to his office, we have our interview. I tell him my life story and what's happening, you know, and what my assets are and this and that. And he says, no problem, I'll represent you, we'll have a good case. The next day, I get a phone call from the same lawyer. Robert, I'm sorry, I cannot represent you. I can't tell you exactly what happened, but there's a conflict of interest and you'll have to find another lawyer. Well, okay, so I found another lawyer, but that's not part of my story at this point. About 6 weeks later, I'm on Thursday night, learning with Rabbi Yaffe, and in the door walks the lawyer. Apparently he had children in Politz, or a kid in Politz or something. He was coming here for something to the school. And he stopped me, he goes, oh, you know what, I can tell you what happened now. He said, when you were leaving my office in the waiting room, you passed a man that was sitting there. That man was having a will drawn up with your wife's name as the beneficiary, as an insurance policy to guarantee that when she leaves the marriage and something happens to him, she'll get something out of it. She was very materialistic. All right? So that was the story. Now you think that's a coincidence. These things all happen for a purpose. I'm a firm believer now in my life that life is not something that happens to you, it's something that happens for you. Everything has a purpose. In any case, something close to that experience, I'm getting ready to get through this divorce, and I said, I have to give her a get. So I call up the best din in Philadelphia. At that time, it was Rabbi Eliyahu Yalis, who, although he was descended from the Belzer Rebbe's, he has part of a dynasty of some sort. He was actually very good friends with Rabbi Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now that has very great importance also. I'll tell you why now. Before everything blew up in my previous marriage, and I was searching, I had read about this sefer called the Tanya. And so I called up the bookstore in Jenkintown, it was Rosenberg's at that time, and I said, do you have an English version of this book I heard about? And they said, yeah. So I drove up there, bought this book, and when I brought it home, and my ex realized that I was in Jenkintown, she exploded. She goes, you went up there for a book and you didn't take me shopping? And so, in any case, I read the Tanya, and there again, everything made sense. I was, in fact, what they call a Benoni. You know, not a Rasha, I'm not a Tzaddik, I'm in the middle, all right? I got my own ladder to go up and down. So, turns out that my great-grandfather, I'll tell you the story now, might have been, probably was Chabad. And the reason I say that is as following. I had arranged to give a get to my wife the following Monday, and that Shabbos, I was not Shomer Shabbos at the time, I looked up this group in Mount Airy, in Germantown, Mount Airy, called Pnei Or. And it was headed by a very famous fellow called Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalami. He himself came from Chabad, but he left that, and he used to teach at the Temple University, various comparative religions and other things. And he was, in fact, a Kabbalist of some sort. So I go to this place, and I'm the first one there. It's early in the morning, and one of his sons let me in. At that time, he was about, I don't know, about my age, probably. And sorry, I'm getting late, but after the ritual service that they had by these old hippies dancing and putting on plays and other things after Torah reading, sitting on the floor, cross-legged, not smoking anything at the time.
Drums?
Banging drums with a banging drums.
They would do all kinds of stuff. I got tapped on the shoulder and somebody said, Reb Zalman wants to see you in his study, and he never invites people up there, so you should feel very special. Anyway, so I go up, and he hands me a bowl of vegetarian cholent. He says, sit here for a minute. And he comes back with this little paperback book in his hand, open, and he says, here, you're gonna need this. It turns out to be a book he wrote himself called The First Step. It's for Baal Tshuva, it's like a guidebook or something. Anyway, this was a chapter on Jewish divorce. Meanwhile, nobody knew me there. I didn't tell anybody there what was going on in my life. He opens this book to the chapter on Jewish divorce, and he says, you're gonna need this. And I was giving my get to my ex-wife that Monday. Blew me away. Anyway, he told me, when you give her the get, after that, take 5 silver coins and put it in her hand and say, we are now disconnected. Which I did. I just followed his advice, for whatever reason. But during that interview, he told me, he asked me my family history and who my grandparents were and so on. And he says, I know the town that he came from, he's a Chabad. So I'll have to trust him on that. A couple of years, no, it was actually just not too far before that event. I went to a party given by my cousins for their parents' 50th wedding anniversary. I have 11 cousins on both sides of the family. Only 2 out of the 11 were not intermarried. That's not a good ratio. That bothered me, but I didn't realize how much it bothered me until I was getting ready to drive home. And as I put the key in the ignition, on the windshield, you know how sometimes you see a reflection on the windshield of yourself? This wasn't myself. There was this white, bearded Jew on the windshield, like a hologram. It was unbelievable. It was like a hallucination, but it was real. Without words, just unspoken language, I was told that I was the last link in the chain and it was up to me. Meaning that generations of Jews would stop with me if I didn't do something about it. I broke down crying right there in the car. I didn't know what was going on. And in any case, and then all of that stuff started happening that I just told you about. So years later, I recognized that image. I saw a photograph of the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. It was his face. It was amazing. So I have this continuity of somehow Chabad and Netanya and all these images going through me. And I was reading Martin Buber's book, Tales of the Hasidim, and I was having all kinds of strange dreams with lots of Hebrew calligraphy and words I didn't understand coming through my dreams. And so I continued to pursue learning So I learned here every Thursday night for years, with various rebbeim. And Rabbi Safran was my chief rebbe. He took me to his home in Lakewood, had many Shabbos and Yom Tovim. We had a core group, a charusa, lots of Baal Teshuvas at that time, and really enjoyed the experience. Kept in touch for a number of years, but lost touch after a while. Continued to learn here. Time?
Good rep, yeah.
Okay. All right. In any case, after sampling the crazy women in the Philadelphia area for 5 years, for the wrong reasons, I decided to look for one for the right reasons, and like you guys, I put an ad in the Exponent. and lo and behold, that beautiful woman right there answered that ad. And we had an instant family, just add hot water. She already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and we then had 2 of our own, and we raised them all in day schools and Torah, and gave them what we thought they needed. The rest is up to them. So I don't know if the chain link is still solid or breaking down, but that remains to be seen.
Thanks.
Beautiful.
Very.